You recognize Senator Shaheen. We'll come back to this in a second. Yeah, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's fitting, as I'm sure people have said already, that we're having this discussion the day 2 days after Osama bin Laden has been killed. After all, as you all point out, it was his masterminding the attacks on the World Trade Center and the United States that got us into this war. And so as we think about what the end game here is, what impact will the death of Osama bin Laden have on that end game? Obviously, it was a huge national security and military and intelligence triumph for the United States. But what will the real impact be, if any, on the Taliban who are operating in Afghanistan, and does it have any impact on our allies as we look at the fight ahead?
I believe the only way it has significant impact would be if it leads the Pakistanis to seriously reconsider their continual provision of a sanctuary to the Taliban. If this leads through some sort of new conversation between the United States, between Washington and Islamabad, to a material change in Pakistani policy, then I think it will have major repercussions. But so long as Pakistan is willing to play the role it's played for all these years and provide sanctuary to the Afghan Taliban, not only does it mean that Osama bin Laden's death will not have material impact on the future of Afghanistan, but it will not essentially have the sort of salutary effects you and I would like to see, more broadly.
Dr. Slaughter.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. I'm not sure we fully know, and one of the things I'm arguing is that we should take this moment to explore. I agree that it could change some of our relations with Islamabad. I think, though, it also may change the willingness of some Taliban to negotiate. There are arguments that Osama bin Laden was very close to the top leadership, to Omar, the top leadership, Mullah Omar of the Taliban. With him gone, that may create some political space. It's at least worth exploring. It also creates political space for us with President Karzai, in the sense that President Karzai often says, well, we're going to stay because we're there for our interests more than we are for his. This is now a moment where we can say, as we're hearing all over the place, although obviously it's a symbolic death, it's a very important symbol, and it gives us a chance to pivot. So that may give us more leverage also with President Karzai. It seems to me we should seize that moment and explore. We're not going to be worse off. We may be substantially better off.
Thank you. Mr. Newman, do you have anything to add to that?
Basically agree. I am much more dubious that it is a moment for negotiations. I have nothing against exploring them. But I think Senator Kerry's description of a possible kind of end state was more realistic. For one thing, there have been a great many negotiations over 30 years in Afghanistan. Almost all of them have fallen apart. Most of them, which are power-sharing agreements, have not worked. I think we need to get out of the American mindset that agreement ends things. Look at negotiations, historically, at least in Afghanistan, much more like the agreements of Middle Ages, Renaissance Europe. They last until one person, one side is strong enough to break them and go with them. So while negotiations are relevant, pinning a lot of hope on them or thinking that because you've inked the page, you've got something, I'm pretty dubious about. I do agree on your question very specifically. This is a place to push Pakistan, but recognizing we have interests in common and we probably have interests that oppose. And one of the, perhaps the thing that we need to clarify most is what the interests are that we have that we will sustain. The confusion and the doubt of Pakistan, Afghanistan, regional players about us is enormously debilitating in this struggle because we are such a huge player. Enemies, friends, and those that are neither take position in part based on where they think we are. And when they don't know, they invent the answer, and then they go from that reasoning.
Well, we're going to have a hearing on Thursday to talk about Pakistan, so that will be an opportunity to explore that a little further. I want to go back to the discussion that Senator Durbin was having earlier, and I'm having trouble, I guess, Mr. Haas, trying to distinguish between the end game that you're describing, which sounds to me very much like what we've been doing in Afghanistan from the time we went in and removed the Taliban until we increased our forces. So I wonder if you could just describe in further detail how that's different so I can understand the distinctions that you're making.
What I'm suggesting is different in two ways. It's different in where we're trying to get to and how we get there. My goal is not a democratic Afghanistan, though I'd like to see it. It's not an Afghanistan that's a total peace, though I'd like to see it. It's not a unified, strong national government. I don't think any of those things is in the cards. What I'm looking for is simply an Afghanistan that has a minimal level of functionality, where above all, it is not a place where Al-Qaeda or groups like it act with impunity. And the way I believe we achieve that, this is a very modest goal. The way I would try to achieve it is through a heavy emphasis, not a sole emphasis, but an emphasis on U.S. counterterrorism capabilities with a degree of training up of Afghan police and army forces, both nationally but also locally, and a degree of diplomacy, particularly one-on-one with the Taliban, to try to draw some red lines with them, and also to try to have some sort of a regional forum. I would dramatically decrease U.S. troop levels. Right now, roughly 100,000. I would reduce them by 3/4 or more quite quickly.
Can you just talk about why what you're just describing is different than what we were doing? Because
sure.
It doesn't sound that different to me.
Well, it sounds quite different to me, and maybe I'm not articulating well, but what the big difference is the current U.S. policy is trying to...
I'm not talking about the current U.S. policy. I'm trying to see if I can understand the distinction you're making between what we should be doing now and what we are doing, and how that is different from what we did when we initially went into Afghanistan and continue to do, really until the buildup after President Obama was elected and began to increase troop size and trainers. Because
Sure.
I'm not understanding the distinction you're making.
Okay, I apologize. I didn't understand your question, Senator. Yeah, the original policy after 9/11, once the government was ousted, was a fairly narrow counterterrorism policy. It did not involve significant training up of Afghan police or army forces at either the national or local level. Now those if you add up Afghan National Army and police, it probably is more than 300,000. So essentially, we've done all that. Particularly in the last couple of years. Plus, there was not a real diplomatic dimension. We allowed the 6+2 forum to essentially go into disuse. The United States did not try to test the Taliban as to whether they had changed their ways when it came to association with Al-Qaeda. So essentially, those are the differences. And what we did also, the big difference, what we started doing, and I would end doing, is I would bring to an end combat operations against the Taliban. Starting 2.5 years ago, the United States made the policy decision that it would henceforth target the Taliban militarily. And that was the principal rationale for the military increases taken in 2009, as well as the subsequent surge. I believe that was ill-advised, and I want to go back to the phase before that, where the United States no longer targets the Taliban militarily on the assumption that Taliban presence is one and the same as Al-Qaeda return. I think that is an incorrect assumption, and I do not believe the United States can, or should rather, conduct policy in Afghanistan based on it. So I would remove that component of our policy.
Can I just jump in there? Again, desire of our policy was not to fight the Taliban for the Taliban's sake. The desire of our policy was to push them back from the gains that they had made when we were following a narrow counterterrorism strategy. And as Ambassador Newman said, also to actually convince the Afghans we were there not just to fight terrorism, but because we had their interests at heart as well. If we had negotiated with the Taliban 2 years ago, or tried to negotiate, we would be in a very different position. I think the way we understand this is that we push back enough so we are now in a position to negotiate with the Taliban with red lines. Maybe we can do that without the Afghan government. I mean, to Senator Kerry's point, it's still a sovereign country. It's a little difficult to be negotiating with the enemy of the government independently of the government, but I would say we try a comprehensive settlement. If we can't get that, we negotiate in other ways. But we had to push back on the Taliban so that we would then be in a position to negotiate the kind of solution you're talking about. We're not there to fight the Taliban for the sake of fighting the Taliban.
We then obviously have a disagreement here. I do not believe we had to do it because I'm not trying to get the Taliban to become great citizens participating in the political life of Afghanistan. I only have one simple goal with the Taliban, is that they do not reestablish the sort of relationship they had with al-Qaeda. I do not believe we had to militarily go to war against the Taliban for the last couple of years to do it. I believe we have always have the option of attacking the Taliban directly. Plus, I believe the Taliban, based upon statements they've made and that have been reported back, they themselves have come to question their deep association with foreigners, which is what al-Qaeda is to them. But I think we have to accept, no matter what happens in Afghanistan, at some point, the south and the east of Afghanistan is going to be dominated by Pashtun political leadership, which is going to be extraordinarily conservative in its behavior. And whether you call them technically Taliban or not, there's going to be unattractive features of that in terms of their vision of a society and how they go about promoting it. But I think that is inevitable, whether we have 100,000 American troops there for 5 more years, then 6 or 7 more years from now, that will happen in any event. That is the future of Afghanistan. At some point, we have to be willing to carry out a foreign policy that accepts a degree of local realities and limits. And one of the problems with our policy in Afghanistan is when we get too ambitious there, and we don't respect, I believe, enough local culture and traditions and realities, we are committing ourselves to an expensive policy that will not have enduring benefits in any way that are commensurate with the military or human or economic investment we are going to be making.
Very
Shaheen.
good.
Well, my
Could I
time's
say
up,
one
but-
thing?
Well, I'll yield back to you, Senator Shaheen. I'm perfectly happy to have you pursue and close out the hearing.